Zambia's President-elect Hakainde Hichilema says that his administration will be categorized by fairness and service delivery. Delivering his election victory speech in Lusaka, Hichilema says that his priorities will include rebuilding the economy, uniting the nation, and creating a space for media freedom. The UPND leader won the presidential elections with more than 2.8 million votes over incumbent President Edgar Lungu's 1.8. Hichilema also thanked his predecessor for graciously conceding.
You will see that in the months ahead. This acknowledgement of our victory to serve, not to be served by the people, is humbling. And a few minutes ago, this list of gracious competitors in the presidential race have added on another colleague who was slow. Sure, he had his own reasons. President Edgar Lungu. I want to thank you, sir, for your message, for conceding defeat, and for indicating that you support a smooth transition, I don't want to call it power, of servant leadership. I think it's the barest minimum. Someone who occupies public office, as you exit, you facilitate the new entrants to continue serving the country and its people where you left it.
Well, for some analysis and just to get a sense of what all of this means, we're now joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective and think tank, and also Managing Director at Four Rivers, Lebohang Pheko. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Peter, and to the viewers.
All right, so one thing that stuck out for me was that this was the third peaceful transition of power to an opposition party in a country. I mean, that is quite remarkable given our continent's history, wouldn't you say?
It is and it isn't. I mean, I think that it does illustrate that there's a thirst for change and a hunger for less traumatic and socially volatile ways of transferring power and of ceding leadership. I do also think that it's worthwhile noting that even though we say that these are opposition parties, the genesis of UPND lies in an interesting alliance between three former parties, one of which was actually unique, the party of the late President Kaunda. So I think that there's an interesting way, it's interesting that we're noting a reassertion of a particular kind of DNA where, in fact, what seems to be new is sometimes a reassertion of existing political formations which perhaps have been in decline. But yes, I think it is a very important moment, especially because we've been quite demoralized of late at the ways in which power has been either transferred or seized over the past few months, notably countries like Mali.
Why do you think Hakainde Hichilema won this time around? Sometimes it's a vote to get the other guy out, and sometimes it's a vote to get the new guy in. What sense do you have now, given the fact that I think this was his fifth or sixth attempt at presidency?
It was the sixth attempt, you're quite right. And I think there are a few things that were possibly at play. The one was other than the debt indebtedness of the country, other than, I think, President Lungu's attempts to basically auction off parts of the copper belt and the copper mining industry to different countries, one being the Chinese, but not only the Chinese. The other, of course, is the escalating debt crisis in and the unemployment, the very sluggish growth. I mean, very sluggish. I think GDP at 0.6%. Of course, there's also been more notably than that, the repressive atmosphere, which was really, I suspect, President Lungu's undoing. So we're aware that the president-elect was infamously incarcerated in 2017 for about 4 months, led to an international outcry. And I guess he got his struggle credentials, as it were, there. And I think we'll remember that Musi Maimane tried to visit him. He was stopped at the airport. I don't think he was permitted to even leave the airport in Lusaka. No less than KK himself, late President Kaunda, was also prohibited from visiting the president-elect. And all of these things have really led to an atmosphere which was very strange to Zambia, very repressive, extremely autocratic and authoritarian. The other thing that may have been his undoing was that, unfortunately, and sometimes quite, I don't want to say typically, but oftentimes the intoxication with power. So he had his own 3-step plan to try to then elongate his own lifespan in the presidency, the usual constitutional tinkering, which would mean that if any of the candidates couldn't get more than 50%, then the constitution would then disallow a second ballot top-up between the two top candidates and so forth. He wanted to abolish the voters' roll. So it was quite a whole sophisticated thing that he wanted to do, to reenact and to really reenact his own power and to transact a form of power which would make it very difficult for any other political leader to take precedence or to really have a showing. All of these things, I think, led to what we're seeing today. It's almost an inevitable demise.
The president-elect seems to be saying the right things, and I guess in the end the proof will be in the eating of the pudding. But do you get a sense that there is a new wave, or have we seen this before?
Yeah, I wish I could get behind the new wave, the third wave, the new dawn. I think even here in South Africa, we're pretty dawned out at the moment. So, unfortunately, we have heard this kind of rhetoric, anti-corruption rhetoric, do things differently rhetoric, here for the people. I'm going to come in for 2 terms, 1 term or 2 terms, and then I'm going to go. Edgar Lungu himself came in on the same ticket. Frederick Chiluba came in on the same ticket. He came in on the ticket which was removing late President Kaunda after his 27-year term on the auspices that it was excessive. And I think late President Chiluba's own undoing was an attempt to tinker with the Constitution and give himself a 3rd term. And of course, that was soon before the country went into a complete economic freefall as well. So I think that, I would love to say that this is a new thing, a new sunrise. The sun has risen and it will never set again. But really, I think let's give it a minute before we become overly euphoric in our praises. But as a symbolic shift of transacting one form of power from one power base to another power base relatively peacefully, I would say at the very least it's a morale booster, not only for Zambia but for the continent as a whole.
So what does the president-elect have to get going with straight away as soon as he gets into office? I think you've given us a clue a little bit earlier on. I mean, there is this unfortunate happening that Zambia defaulted on a repayment, didn't they, to international lenders?
Yeah, that's the first time that's ever happened. And I mean, so far Zambia owns foreign lenders about $12 billion or 8 billion pounds or so, which is a huge amount. And you're quite right. Last year, they missed an interest payment, making it the first African country to default on a loan during the pandemic. And it's also facing, Zambia has been facing other difficulties with previous to the pandemic. Since 1998, this is the first time that Zambia has actually been in a recession. Fair enough that COVID-19 has not been gentle on any of us, for the vast majority of countries. But certainly the unemployment figures rose quite significantly over the past year to the official figures now of about 12.7%, according to the ILO. And typically, unfortunately, majority of those are young people. Young people, in fact, are the ones who seem to have been the ones who pushed the president-elect over the edge, over the line in this regard. And I think that President Hichilema has to be fairly appreciative of them, because the previous thing as well that we saw was a lot of voter apathy in Zambia. I think at the last election, the pundits suggested that only about 30% of possible voters had actually come out to vote. This time we saw about 69, just under 70% of the people on the potential voter roll, if I've interpreted the stats appropriately, coming out. So these are the people whom President-elect Hichilema must ensure have some kind of a dividend and have some kind of skin in the game by creating jobs, or at least creating a conducive environment. And I think the other thing, of course, is unfortunately corruption, which has the graft culture. And I mean, to be fair, again, certainly not unique to South Africa. We're watching the Zondo Commission here. So the graft culture, which he has promised to stem. But I think the concern would probably be that his methodology is, rather than to think about alternative economic models, is to plunge even more further, even more deeply into debt. He's already talking about opening conversations with the IMF, recalibrating and recalculating the debt and the interest rates, which basically resets the debt. You almost have to pay a bit longer. So it's kind of a momentary reprieve, but the long-term effects are very problematic. So I am not particularly excited about his very, very orthodox, very, very IMF-friendly, Washington consensus-friendly way of framing the economy.
Now, yes, COVID affected everybody, but a lot of countries have started to show positive growth, and copper prices have really been pretty good. So there must be something else that's been a problem, and I think maybe one of them was corruption. What else then? Was it just mismanagement?
I think it was mismanagement, but I think also factionalism as well plays a huge role, Peter. And I think, you're quite right. There were record copper prices in Zambia this year, which were described by some as some kind of a double-edged sword. There was a new mining tax regime, which also came into effect last year. There were mining royalty payments, which would not have been treated as a deductible expense. And I think what has happened in the midst of all that is, unfortunately, when Glencore, which we're all very familiar with, exited Zambia, they then took a stake in, I think, a 73% stake in the Mopani copper mines. The deal was for just $1 to see Glencore then recover about over $1 billion. In the midst of that, there is the fear that, of course, a lot of the taxes went a bit astray. There's also the fear that in the midst of this, there was also, how can I put it gently? I can't put it gently, that there was a bit of nepotic cronyism in the allocation of the benefits in that regard. So it is very unfortunate. I think the other thing as well is just the basic governance, where there's also been the perception, rightly or wrongly, having lived in Zambia at some point, I think that there's also been the perception that tribal politics, and narrow ethno-nationalisms have also played a role in the allocation of benefits, the allocation of tenders, the allocation of wealth, and even social development. Again, not a uniquely Zambian issue, but I think for a country of only 17 million people to have 70 or so ethnic groups or ethno-nationalisms and so forth, we contend with about 9 in South Africa. And that's really quite a claustrophobic way of dealing with issues. And I mean, these are historical things. We'll remember that a lot of the concessions that came from the independence agreement in 1964 before were very, very much contested, where it was felt that somebody like the late Honorable Simon Kapwepwe, I'll allow people to go into their history books, but he was some people who felt that he should have been in the deputy presidentship was because of tribal politics. So I think that plays a massive role in the way that people perceive benefits and favor, and some may sometimes even perceive corruption where there is none.
Lebohang, we're running out of time, but I do want to get one question in, if you can try and be brief with this one. China and Chinese business and Chinese influence has been a major sticking point in Zambia. How will he deal with this? And then, of course, the other thing is, does this election have some kind of regional impact? Are there countries in the region that are looking and seeing what's happened there and perhaps wondering for themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a couple of things. The history between Zambia and China is also quite complex, and you're quite right. There's levels of, I guess, resentments that have been simmering over the last few years. Some partly because of the treatment of African people by some of the Chinese firms that come in, and I suppose the perception that that some of the Chinese firms or the Chinese expatriates do seem to isolate themselves and seem to deal with the locals extremely disrespectfully. Having traveled in the region, I concur with some of those sentiments. And I think that the other thing is, as well, is this very extractivist model, extracting benefits, extracting labor, whilst often importing all of the labor and the manpower for this, which does nothing for the local domestic employment levels. In terms of what this means for the rest of the region, as you rightly say, and as you know, you mentioned countries like Swaziland, you mentioned, of course, even Zimbabwe, the neighbor, even Uganda, by the way, whether this gives a bit of robustness. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that what this does is it does kind of lead to the politics of impossibility. This is a person, President-elect Hichilema, who tried no less than 6 times to ascend to the presidency. It does help that he's one of the wealthiest men in the country. That does no harm. So he's got the resources to try again. So he's not exactly the little train that could. But I do think that in terms of just the cognitive hope that it gives a lot of other regions and a lot of other countries across the region, let's hope that it does impact the general governance DNA for the rest of Southern Africa and beyond.
Lebohang, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much.